Okay, I think we can start because I see Hal Harden getting ready to log in. So I know this is going to be good. Welcome on behalf of the Women's Political Collaborative of Tennessee. We are so happy that you are joining us. Thank you for all that this organization does. It's a nonpartisan organization. We're fortunate that so many elected officials are members of this group. Tonight, we are so fortunate to get to talk to a Middle East expert in this time of crazy stuff going on with Afghanistan. We're so glad that Kai Bird can be here to join us for this book. You can see all of Larry's notes. The Outlier. The Outlier is available for sale at our friends' bookstore here in town, Parnassus Books. We love to encourage folks to shop local if you're going to buy the book. And you're going to be moderated and interviewed tonight by Larry Woods, my husband and book partner. Larry is a civil rights attorney. He's been practicing civil rights since his hair was a different color. He also teaches constitutional law at Tennessee State University, and he is a bookaholic. So I'm going to turn it over to Larry, and I'll ask you all to keep your camera up. Let's see, to not show your video, and so you don't embarrass Joyce, and to put yourself on mute and turn it over to Larry.
Thanks. And before we actually start, let me also add, I see quite a few people who've already signed up, who I know worked for, volunteered in the Carter presidency campaign just a few years back, who worked in the Carter administration. I see the chief U.S. attorney that President Jimmy Carter appointed for Tennessee has joined us. Thank you, Hal. I see a lot of women who've been very active in politics in Tennessee and other places. So as Kai Bird and I talk, and hopefully most of the talking done by Kai, he's the expert. As you have questions, comments, put them up on chat, and toward the end of the program, we'll try to get to your chat comments or questions if we haven't already covered it by then. Kai, we appreciate your time and energy in appearing tonight. I think Sarah Lee just said that Parnassus Books here in town has this book, The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter by Kai Bird. I just read it and finished it about a week ago. It's fascinating for anybody interested in politics, which of course is your organization. This is an absolute captivating analysis of how Carter got elected, and more importantly, what he and his colleagues did and failed to do in their 4 years in Washington. So Kai, let's start there. What kind of grade do you give President Carter? Was he a success? Was he a failure? Start us off.
Well, Larry, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be virtually in Tennessee. And to answer your question bluntly, I'd give him an A+.
Good. Really, I like that a lot. I bet most of our audience does.
But I know most Americans, think of Jimmy Carter as, well, probably a decent man and a great ex-president, but they would then quickly add, but unfortunately, he was a failed president. And what they mean was, I think, is that, he didn't get reelected. He was a one-term president. What they forget, and what was so astonishing for me as I dug into the research and went into the archives, his presidential papers, is to discover just how much he accomplished in those 4 short years. He really passed more domestic legislation than certainly Obama did in 8 years, and more than Bill Clinton did in his 2 terms. And it's a forgotten record. And then on the foreign policy side, he had enormous diplomatic achievements that were quite consequential. So I would argue that his presidency was, it had its pitfalls. He was a victim of certain historical events, let's say, but his was a consequential presidency.
I think your book really presents the analysis and frames the kind of issues you were just referring to better than anything I've experienced and read or been associated with since Carter went out of office. I think it's probably as near universal in our nation as it's possible these days that people agree with what you said, that Carter is our greatest former president. His life, his work since he was president is the kind of thing we can all admire and encourage and support. And your book does a really good job of what you just referred to, of reminding me and the readers of the kind of accomplishments he did succeed in: the Panama Canal Treaty, the Camp David Accords, the work he tried to do in the Middle East. And on the domestic side, you know, what he appointed as federal judges, more women, more African Americans, more Hispanics than all the previous presidents in our history put together. And that was a real sea change in Washington, wasn't it?
It was a revolution. He remade the judiciary with those appointments.
Yeah.
And, you know, some of them were quite controversial. Some of them were very memorable. So for instance, he appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a young woman lawyer at the time, to the Court of Appeals. And that, of course, gave her the platform from which she was later elevated by Clinton into the Supreme Court. And she became a great Supreme Court justice.
Yeah.
So this is one of the minor things that Carter did. It's an amazing list. You know, he appointed, people forget, and people are kind of, they can't figure out often, even at the time, how to pigeonhole him politically. Was he a liberal? Was he a conservative? Was he, well, he was a sort of liberal on social issues, but he was a sort of small town fiscal conservative on the federal budget. But he was a great consumer advocate. And you may recall when he had secured the Democratic nomination, but before he was elected president, he was in Plains for a few weeks of so-called vacation, and he had Ralph Nader come down to Plains, Georgia, and Ralph, in his black pinstripe suit, played the umpire for the softball game that they had almost every day in those weeks. And you know, he and Carter bonded. They had, you know, Carter cooked him breakfast one morning in his home, and Nader got his ear and persuaded him to consider appointing a whole slew of his acolytes, Ralph Nader warriors on the consumer safety issues. And so, for instance, he got Joan Claybrook appointed to the Auto Safety Board. And Joan, you know, was determined to get the auto companies, require them mandate safety belts and to install, under mandatory regulations, airbags. And these two measures alone, which were fought bitterly by the auto companies and ironically enough by the auto workers union too, who feared that it might cost jobs. But these two measures saved probably 9,000 to 10,000 lives a year ever since. A major, major accomplishment. Well, Carter did all sorts of things in that vein to protect consumers. He deregulated the airline industry, which allowed competition and airfares to go so low that Americans, for the middle class Americans, for the first time were able to, you know, regularly fly on vacations. This really changed the landscape in America. So it was indeed a consequential presidency.
Your book makes a point over and over again that Carter really paid attention to changing the rules and regulations of the agencies to make government programs and beneficial government policies more available to everyone, especially to middle income and lower income groups and people, that contrary to what a lot of the criticism was, as I remember it at the time, Carter was really paying attention to the details because he understood that if he didn't change the regulatory details, making the great speeches and writing the great proposals wouldn't amount to anything. And your example of Joan Claybrooks and national highway safety is a sterling example of that. A lot of Nader Raiders, you mentioned in the book, worked for him. A lot of the what I'll call the liberal wing of the Democratic Party worked for him, as well as moderates. And as you just said, it was difficult at times, I think, for me as someone involved in politics at the time. Some days I'd wake up and think Carter's really the kind of liberal I want in office as president. And some days I'd wake up and think, well, he's been awfully moderate on an issue that needs to be pushed harder, but at least he's sort of in the right direction. And then I would get not embarrassed, but upset that some of Carter's primary aides in the White House, Ham Jordan, Jody Powell, others that you refer to in the book, were getting blistered in the national media, primarily by the Washington Post, but Times would follow it, of course. They were getting blistered in the national media for misbehavior, for doing outrageous things that are still issues today with the Me Too movement and that kind of thing. And as somebody watching from Nashville, Tennessee, I didn't know what to think. I thought, surely these people that I'm hoping and praying are doing great things are not harassing women and snorting cocaine and the other kind of stuff that Washington Post was putting on the front page.
No, you're right. That's a very important part of what happened to the Carter administration was the Washington Post, and specifically Sally Quinn, who was married to Ben Bradley, the editor. Sally Quinn was a wonderful writer, very entertaining writer on the newly formed style section of the Post. And she just had a ball going after Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell and Landon Butler and some of the other Georgia boys, as she called them. And, it was a cultural disconnect. The Washington establishment didn't quite know what to think of Jimmy Carter. And the Georgia boys and Carter himself really didn't understand Washington. In one of my interviews with Carter, I asked him, why did he turn down so many dinner invitations from Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post? And he said, after a pause, well, that was probably a mistake. He never spent much time trying to scratch the backs of the Georgetown set. And so in retaliation, Sally Quinn and Ben Bradley just made fun of it. They portrayed Carter as a hick, a Southern hick. They portrayed Hamilton Jordan as, an out of control 33-year-old guy who walked around in Levi's. Actually, he never wore jeans. He wore khakis, but he would wear work boots to the White House, and they would make fun of this. Well, Hamilton Jordan was a really savvy political operator. He was the guy who wrote the memo in 1974 explaining to Carter how he could seize the nomination in the wake of the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War, and gave him the roadmap to campaign hard first in Iowa and get some kind of victory, a plurality out of the caucuses there, which no one had ever tried to do before, and then roll on to New Hampshire. So it was Hamilton Jordan who came up with that brilliant political strategy. And he continued to write these amazing memos, which have now all been declassified. And you can see Jordan's mind at work. And he's just brilliant. But this at the time, the Post just made fun of him, and Jody Powell as well. Pat Oliphant, the political cartoonist, had numerous cartoons on the front page of the Washington Post, portraying them in dungarees and overalls and portraying them as hayseeds and with straw hats, and it was just shameful what they did.
It really was. I mean, I'm as human as anybody. Gossip attracts my eye. Maybe I'll stop reading
Right.
the first couple of sentences, but gossip does attract interest and readership. But I assume that, especially when it comes to the national media like the Post and the Times, et cetera, I've always assumed they try to get it right and they try to stay away from the gossip and focus on important issues. But again, the example of the Washington dinner that we all heard about at the time, and we all remember, when the Washington Post, Sally Quinn wrote an article saying that Ham Jordan, the #1 advisor to the President of the United States, made a vulgar remark to the wife of the Egyptian ambassador about her body cleavage, etc. I mean, that was reported.
Yeah, he said he always wanted to visit the pyramids, peering down, apparently.
Right.
But no one else at the table heard him say that. And the ambassador's
including the
wife
ambassador's
denied
wife.
it.
They all denied it. But
Right.
that part of the story never got printed in the Post. I mean, much less the 3,000 papers and news sources that then followed what the Post said. The truth
Well,
there,
even worse,
never caught up.
that was malicious little gossip,
Yeah.
But worse was when the owners of Studio 54 in New York City were indicted for tax fraud. And one of their lawyers, one Roy Cohen, who at the time was mentoring the young Donald Trump on how to never apologize to the media. Well, Roy Cohen got the owners of Studio 54 to sign an affidavit saying that Hamilton Jordan had come to the studio one night and sniffed or bought cocaine. And it was, an outrageous allegation. It had no evidence to it. But for a moment, it distracted the prosecutors. And because Jimmy Carter believed in government ethics, he had persuaded Congress to pass the government and ethics law, which mandated the appointment of a special prosecutor whenever some high-ranking White House official is accused of a crime. So a special prosecutor was appointed, a grand jury was convened, and about 12 months later, Hamilton Jordan, after spending $140,000 of his own money, which he didn't have, he was exonerated, and the grand jury voted 24-0 not to indict him. But it was front page headlines at the time, in the middle of the 1980 campaign, that the president's chief of staff was, sniffing cocaine.
And the shocking part of that story to me is that the news media who were reporting this story widely knew that the source for it was ultimately Roy Cohn, a lawyer who helped run the Joe McCarthy Red Witch Hunt in the 1950s, a lawyer who in those proceedings was demonstrated to have lied and cheated and, bad character flaws in every direction, who then practiced law using those methods in New York for decades. And as you pointed out, mentored and helped Donald Trump and many of his legal problems in New York in his early days. They were using him for this source without ever stopping to say to the readers, by the way, our source here is very questionable. You don't ever see that in the Post or any of the other reporting sources about Carter and these bad stories.
It was outrageous, but then come to think of it, do you remember the killer rabbit incident?
Yeah, I remember that story.
I mean,
Tell everybody what you're referring to.
Okay, so it was a slow news day in August when the Washington Post put on a headline on the front page, "Killer Rabbit Attacks the President." And then you read this wire service story about how Jimmy was on a rowboat on a pond near his house in Plains one weekend a few months earlier, and he was fishing. And suddenly some dogs were barking, and there's a splash, and he sees a swamp rabbit swimming towards his rowboat. So he took an oar and and splashed the water and got him to divert to go off the shore. And so Jimmy himself told this story to Jody Powell. A few weeks later, they're sitting on the Truman balcony in the White House, and Jody thought it was a funny as hell story. And a few days after that, he tells it to a reporter in a bar down the street from the White House. And this reporter puts it out on the wire and embellishes it a little bit, because Jody has embellished it. So it becomes front page. Now, Carter initially thought this is just a funny, silly story, but it took on a life of its own, and it was used by the national press all over the country. The story is picked up to sort of make fun of Carter, to say that even he couldn't even defend himself against a killer rabbit. People questioned whether rabbits could swim. Senator Bob Dole, Republican minority leader in the Senate, held a press conference and attacked Carter for being mean to a rabbit. But it took on a life of its own. The story was used to sort of ridicule Carter, who by the summer of 1979, was under attack, not only from the Iranian Revolution that had just happened earlier that year, but rising gas prices, an energy shortage, and a challenge, growing. It was clear that Ted Kennedy, senator from Massachusetts, was probably going to challenge him for the nomination. So he was being portrayed as a Southern bumpkin who turned out to be an ineffectual politician who probably should be replaced because he wasn't liberal enough.
And clearly the media treatment of Carter and his close insiders encouraged Senator Ted Kennedy. Senator Kennedy and his aides every day were reading in the Post and similar sources that Carter's a bumpkin, Carter's a hick, Carter doesn't know what he's doing. His aides are morally questionable or stupid or...
Well, they knew better. They knew that this was actually the hardest working president they'd seen in decades. Carter kept farmer's hours. He was up at 5:30 every morning. He was in the Oval Office by 6:30, sometimes earlier. Spent 12 hours. He'd read 200, 300 pages of memos every day. We see this because now you can look at them in the archives and you can see his handwriting on the margins. And he was just a relentless reader. And you're right, he paid attention to detail. He wanted to figure out what was the right thing to do. And then he was mocked for paying attention to too much detail. And he couldn't win. So his own speechwriter, James Fallows, worked for him for the first 2 years writing speeches, and then quit because he wanted to go back to journalism. And the very first essay he wrote in the Atlantic Monthly was a long, long piece attacking Jimmy Carter for, it was hard to see what he was being attacked for. But the thing that people will remember from that story is that Fallows reported that Carter spent so much attention to detail that he was even wasting time in the White House managing the schedule for the White House tennis court, which actually wasn't true. So, he couldn't win with the press, certainly, and it's very unfortunate.
Yeah, the way he got portrayed in the media and at some points in his political campaigning. I noted, for example, that my longtime friend Bob Shrum, who ran very, very intelligently 6 or 7 presidential campaigns for Democrats, unfortunately never won any of those campaigns. He worked for Carter in the national presidency campaign for about 2 weeks and quit. Yeah. And I know from talking to people that know, basically quit because he thought Carter was going to be too moderate. He was reading the papers even then, reading the media accounts even then, and getting seriously misled by them, I think. at a point where he didn't really know Carter yet. Of course, he's going to turn around and help run Ted Kennedy's campaign against Carter 4
Well,
years.
Shrum was a Kennedy man from the beginning, and
Right.
that's where his loyalties lay.
Right.
But aside from the optics, it's important on this the rivalry between Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter to point out that there was some substance involved. But
Right.
here, this is, I just thought when I dug into this story, this was fascinating to me. As a young man, when I was a reporter in my 20s in the 1970s, covering the Carter years in part, I too thought he wasn't liberal enough. And I was kind of sympathetic to Kennedy's challenge because I thought that Kennedy was in favor of national health insurance. And I thought that was
Right.
an important issue. Well, you dig into the archives and you figure out what was actually going on. Carter too was in favor of national health insurance. He campaigned on it in '76. He supported Kennedy's bill. But once he got into the Oval Office, he looked at the numbers and, he did worry about the federal deficit. He was a fiscal conservative in that way. And he just thought that Kennedy's bill was too expensive to provide immediately all at once health insurance across the country. Federal system, single payer plan was essentially Kennedy's plan. And he didn't think that Kennedy actually had the votes, particularly in the Senate, to get it passed. So he had Ted into the Oval Office and suggested, let's compromise, let's have a national catastrophic health insurance law that would make it impossible for any American family to spend more than $5,000 on a health event in a single year. And, this would have been, if it had happened, it would have been an enormous foot in the door to, a few years later, probably, the creation of a national health insurance system. But Kennedy said no, he wouldn't compromise. Carter refused to compromise, and they went to loggerheads on this, and we didn't get any health bill passed. But Kennedy used this issue as the primary issue on which to campaign for the nomination against a sitting president. And it greatly weakened Carter. He fought off the challenge. Carter, people forget that Carter could be tough and politically ruthless. Hunter Thompson, the gonzo journalist, famously wrote in Rolling Stone that when he first met Jimmy Carter in 1974, he thought he was the most ruthless politician he'd ever seen. And, he's exaggerating a little bit, but Carter did what was necessary to defeat Ted Kennedy in primary after primary, but Kennedy hung on, refused to concede, even when the numbers made it impossible for him to ever seize the nomination. He went all the way to the convention before he conceded. And this really weakened Jimmy Carter at this point, heading into the national campaign against Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, no question about it. Certainly most of the far majority of Kennedy's supporters voted for Carter in the general election, I'm sure, but how eager they were and how good they felt about it at the time probably didn't rank very highly, because that was a bitterly fought primary contest between Carter and Kennedy.
Well, it's also important to remember that the contest between Reagan and Carter in the general election was actually closer than people remember. It was a landslide in the end in the Electoral College, but up until 2 weeks before the voting, Carter was within 5 points in the polls, within the margin of error.
Right.
But in the end, he had taken a lot of tough decisions. In '76, he had won the evangelical vote. He had won African Americans, of course. He'd won the votes of white Southern men. He took the South with him. He won working class union members. He won the Jewish American vote by 72%. And then in 1980, he lost the Jewish American vote. He only took a plurality of like 45%. And why? despite Camp David, despite bringing peace between Egypt and Israel and taking Egypt off the battlefield for Israel, he was perceived by Jewish American leaders as being too tough on Israel, lobbying, trying to strong arm them into not to build settlements in the West Bank. And he believed that Begin had promised that he would put a freeze on settlements. And he thought that Begin had either lied to him or deceived him. And he was outraged by this. And he thought this was a terrible thing for the security of Israel. And if you continue to build settlements in the West Bank, you're going to close the door to a two-state solution and to peace eventually with the Palestinians. And indeed, he's been sort of proven right, prescient about this today. Anyway, he lost the Jewish vote in '80. He also lost the Southern vote. He lost the vote of Southern white men. He only got a plurality of labor union voters. He lost the evangelical vote. Why? I mean, he was an evangelical, but by 1980, Jerry Falwell and his moral majority group were criticizing Carter as turning his back on his Southern Baptist roots. Why? Because he refused to give tax-exempt status to the white Christian academies that were popping up all over the South in response to the integration of public schools.
Bob Jones School.
Bob Jones School, but also these private little academies, for high schools and elementary schools all over the South.
In the 1970s, or when that was happening.
That was happening, and Carter refused. He, as a good conventional Southern Baptist, he believed in the separation of church and state, and he wasn't going to give tax-exempt status to quote Christian academies that were really simply popping up to evade integration. So he took a lot of tough decisions that cost him politically in 1980.
It's an old story among political campaign people. When your candidate's running for election, running for office, most voters don't care how good or what he did for us yesterday. It's what are you going to do for me today and tomorrow that counts. And therefore, as you expressed when you and I were talking right before we went on the air tonight, Carter really got caught up in a lot of issues and movements that he didn't cause, but he paid the penalty for it, essentially, ranging from your example of we couldn't agree on health care with Senator Kennedy, and therefore that fed the urge, the burgeoning movement of liberal Democrats to find a candidate to run against him in the Democratic primaries. Same thing on the Camp David Accords and the two-state solution. Healthcare stayed with us as a national problem still today, but no real movement for another 30 years till we get to President Obama. Clinton's failed with it, couldn't get the votes together. We really lost a golden opportunity there. Same thing with the two-state solution. We're all seeing those problems again, continuing today. And the same thing that you referred to a minute ago on the economy. The biggest economic issue of the 1970s was inflation. And Carter really deserves the credit, as you point out in your very thoroughly research on this subject. Carter really deserves the credit for solving the inflation problem in the 1970s, but it cost him dearly politically.
Absolutely, yeah.
He put the guy.
Stagflation was a terrible thing. It was eating into people's, working income, and he worried about it. He tried to battle it in various which ways, and finally, out of enormous frustration, he made a very difficult decision to appoint one Paul Volcker to be head of the Fed, knowing from his advisors who warned him not to do it, that Volcker was going to jack up the interest rates and restrict the money supply and really make the economy scream in order to end the cycle of inflation.
That strategy absolutely worked, but it took 2 years to take effect.
Took 2 years, right?
Last year of Carter's administration, when he desperately needed votes, first year of Reagan's administration. Nowadays, you read it in the media as if Reagan solved the problem because it got solved during his first year when it
Right.
was exactly what you described. I remember when the Fed and Volcker and President Carter pushed interest rates to 20% in 1978 or 1979. Unbelievable interest rates for post-World War II America, but it was what was required in order to stop that stagflation, and it did work. He should have gotten great credit for it. Instead, businesses and the millions of people upset about their interest rates on their loans, business and personal, going through the roof in a skyrocket way, really condemned him to lose a lot of support in that election. Carter did what he knew was right, even though he realized at the time, I think, that it was going to cost him a lot of votes.
Right. No, he was a victim of historical circumstances, not only stagflation, but also the Iranian Revolution, which, you know, he couldn't have done anything to stop. That was an organic thing happening in the streets of Tehran. But it happened, and in early '79, Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, and later that year, you know, after months and months of people lobbying Carter to give the exiled Shah political asylum in this country, Carter just refused. He said, no, I don't want to do that. Let the guy go play tennis in Bermuda or Morocco. But he wrote in his diary, we can now read in his presidential diary, he feared that if he gave him political asylum, the Shah, the emotional reaction in the streets of Tehran would be such that maybe they would take over our embassy and seize hostages. That's actually in his diary. It's very prophetic. That's exactly what did happen when Carter finally gave in to a lobbying effort launched by David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger and John J. McCloy, a powerful Wall Street lawyer, who formed actually a private lobbying operation that they named Project Alpha. And it had a budget, and they hired a publicist, and they set out a calendar where each of them would lobby some high-ranking member of the Carter administration every week to gain the Shah admission for political asylum. Carter was really annoyed by this, but finally gave in when his own Secretary of State came to him and said that there was new information that the Shah had cancer and he needed treatment in New York. Well, even that turned out to be not true. He had cancer, but he could have gotten treatment almost anywhere and could have gotten better treatment, as it turns out. Anyway, that precipitated exactly what Carter feared. Our embassy was overrun, and nearly 60 hostages were held for 444 days. Carter then did the really politically tough thing. He refused to take any military action because he feared that this would endanger the lives of the hostages. And he hoped that, and his Secretary of State, Cy Vance, reassured him that diplomacy would work in the end. But he succeeded in bringing home all of those hostages, but after the election, and it really, that whole affair greatly weakened him, made many Americans think that he was ineffectual and weak and couldn't handle the job. So it's another tragedy.
And Republican operative Bill Casey, who helped run the OSS office in World War II and later was director of the CIA, pulled dirty tricks here.
Oh boy, did he pull a dirty trick? So I have a small chapter in the book that pulls together all the evidence from a congressional investigation that took place in 1991, but with new evidence, and in particular, one very smoking gun kind of document. it all comes down to this question. Did Bill Casey, who was Reagan's campaign manager in the summer of 1980, did Casey, who loved covert intrigue and operations, and dating back to his OSS days, as you mentioned, did Bill Casey go to London and then Madrid, Spain, secretly over one weekend in late July and meet with a representative of the Ayatollah Khomeini? And I have a document that I report on, a White House document from the first Bush presidency when they were investigating this, reporting that they had found a cable from the Madrid embassy, quote, reporting that Bill Casey is in town for purposes unknown. And this is late July of 1980. So I think he went, I think he made some promises to the Ayatollah's representatives. And this is an outrageous interference in US foreign policy. It's kind of treasonous. It probably prolonged the hostage crisis. But Casey did it because he could, and he could do it secretly. It didn't come out until after he died. And his fear was that Carter would get a diplomatic victory and get the hostages released in October, just before the election. So that's why it's called the October surprise. And it's a fascinating story.
And Casey was right, I think. I think if President Carter had succeeded in the release of the hostages that fall, either through his patient diplomacy or through
so.
his attempt at
He would have won that
won.
election. Yeah.
He would have beaten Reagan in that election. It was that close, as you pointed out earlier. And it's so reminding me of the allegations against Richard Nixon in 1968, that Nixon sent high-ranking people from his campaign to meet with representatives of the North Vietnamese to undermine what Johnson and Humphrey were trying to do, or Humphrey at least was trying to do in 1968 about the war.
Yes, well, he actually sent messages to the South Vietnamese generals not to cooperate with the peace talks that were going ahead, and this indeed delayed the peace overtures that Johnson had underway in 68 as the election was coming to a front. And yeah, that's been proven now from Nixon's chief of staff's personal diary. What's his name?
You know, these examples, these important examples and illustrations, anecdotes historical ones that you point out and cite in your book, you know, I feel strongly one of the reasons that so many Americans get disaffected from politics. Politicians lie to us. Politicians don't mean it when they make campaign promises. Right. What was Carter's record on that? Did he try to do what he said he would do in his campaign, or not?
Well, you know, Carter was, as the title of my biography is, he was an outlier. He was really a very unusual politician, and you will recall that he, on the campaign stump, he made it a regular feature of his campaign stump speech that I will never lie to you, the American people. Well, when his personal lawyer, Charlie Curbo, who was sort of the Atticus Finch of the Carter administration, a very slow-talking Georgia drawl, country lawyer who drove to his corporate, very high-powered corporate law firm in Atlanta in a pickup truck every day. Anyway, Charlie Curbo was the real character. But when Curbo found out that Carter was telling the American people regularly that he would never lie to them, Curbo said to Carter when in person, he says, "Jimmy, don't you understand? You've just lost the liar vote."
None of those liars are going to vote for you, Mr. President. You're going to tell the truth. Yeah. But Carter took risk in that 1976 campaign, one of which was one that really struck home with me in the 4 or 5 years in the late 1960s before they changed the Selective Service Law. I did a lot of draft counseling. I had more than 500 clients that avoided the Selective Service system through efforts, thanks to the American Friends Society, the Quakers, and the research work they'd done across the nation. And Carter, in the campaign, I remember the example you said, I think it was a speech in Portland, Oregon, said to the audience while he was running for president in 76, I'm going to issue an amnesty, a pardon for everybody that went to Canada to avoid the draft during the Vietnam War. And this is from a candidate and a guy whose background was military. He's a US Naval Academy graduate. He served in the Navy under Admiral Rickover in the nuclear submarine fleet, et cetera, for years before his father's death, and the family circumstances brought him back home to revitalize the family business. I mean, his background is just the opposite of what you would expect from somebody who's then going to promise amnesty and then what? Issued that pardon, what, his first day in office as president?
His very first day in the Oval Office, the first meeting he had was with Max Cleland, who was an amputee victim of the Vietnam War. And he had appointed Cleland to be director of the Veterans Administration. And so he had Cleland in and he told him, well, I'm going to issue this amnesty. And Cleland warned him that, it was going to be very controversial and it was going to get into a lot of trouble. And Carter leaned down and over his Cleland's wheelchair and said, Max, I'm going to do it. I don't care what anyone thinks. That was his attitude. It was the right thing to do. So by God, I'm going to do it.
I think that's classic Jimmy Carter. As we're drawing toward the finish here, let me suggest people turn your videos on, send in your chat suggestions or questions.
We'll start with Hal.
And Hal Hardin, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on a lot of what we're talking
Even if you
about.
don't have his beard.
And some of my misogamy, I know you do as well. I can remember, I see where Thomas Glenn Pelham's on the chat with us here. And his father, who was my debate coach in college, his father, Glenn Pelham, served in the state Senate one desk over from Jimmy Carter. And I can remember when I was doing legal aid and civil rights work in Atlanta in 1970, I walked in Glenn Pelham's office one day and said, tell me about this guy running against Carl Sanders for governor. I always thought Sanders was the good guy for people like me, but I wasn't here when he was governor, really. Tell me about Carter. And Thomas Glenn Pelham's father promptly explained to me the facts of life, that Carter was exactly what a liberal Democrat ought to like, ought to want in office, that's what Carter's instincts and that's where Carter's heart was. And I sort of said, well, how come he's not campaigning on that? And Pelham laughed at me and said, because he wants to win. That's why he's not campaigning on that in Georgia. In fact, very reminiscent of some of your stories in the book. I remember the day I was convinced Carter was going to win and beat Carl Sanders in a big upset, really, in the Georgia Democratic primary. It was the day there was a county fair or state fair in North Georgia, and some drunken or foolish guy insulted Jimmy Carter's wife, Rosalind, and Carter slugged him. And of course, that was the front page headline all across the state. Gubernatorial candidate slugs, guy at this.
Whoa, I never heard that story.
And I knew that day Carter's going to win this governor's election. He just demonstrated to everybody he's a,
wow. I should have had that story in my book.
I'll get you one of the clippings about it here.
Okay.
Send it to you.
All right.
Tell me about the Pulitzer Prize. You're a Pulitzer Prize winner. There are not many of you in the nation. What did you win your Pulitzer Prize for? What was that like? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, they award one Pulitzer Prize in biography every year, just one. And I won it in 2006 for a biography that I did with my good friend, Martin J. Sherwin, of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, the famous American physicist. So it's a wonderful story about Oppenheimer, full biography from his childhood through, and about this guy who becomes celebrated as America's most famous scientist, aside from Albert Einstein, and because he gives us the atomic bomb in 1945, and then 9 years later he's put on trial, in effect, in a security hearing and stripped of his security clearance in a very sort of kangaroo court kind of proceeding, and humiliated because of his opposition to the building of the hydrogen bomb. So it's a fascinating story, and I was lucky enough to won the Pulitzer for it. My co-author Marty worked only 25 years on that book, and brought me aboard the last 5 years. So but it's a wonderful prize to win. It's a prize that helps to sell books, which are, as you know,
Sure.
very hard to, it's a tough business. And that book is still in print and is sold, I don't know, about 175,000 copies so far.
Wow, that's great. That really is, especially for biography.
Yeah.
And you're the director, and I'm sure I don't have the title right, for the Biography Center in New York, correct?
I'm the executive director of something very weird little center called the Leon Levy Center for Biography at City University's Graduate Center. And it's an unusual organization in that it's the only biography center in the country. And the only thing we do is we give out 5 or 6 fellowships every year of $72,000 a pop to working biographers. Some of them are academics, some of them are journalists, some of them are first-time biographers. And we also put on public events like this one these days on Zoom in the midst of the pandemic. But we have probably 15 or 20 public events every year, usually in an auditorium at the City University in the downtown Manhattan.
So I bet I and many of the people listening in tonight can go to your website and sign up for that mailing list for those events.
You can, yes, please
And
do.
what is that website?
Just punch in Leon Levy Center for Biography. Leon
Levy, L-E-V-Y?
L-E-V-Y, yes.
Okay. Leon Levy Center for Biography. That's great. So what's your current writing project, or what's your next book?
Larry, I'm exhausted from writing Carter. It took me 6 years.
Well, it should be. It's what, I've got it here in my hand, 800 pages or thereabouts.
It's about 780.
Yeah, 760 or 70 pages, dense, lots of footnotes, tons of documentation. I can't tell you how impressed I am with this. I read or try to read all the political type biographies that come along. It's been one of my favorite books to read in the last 10 years because you really dig down and name the names and who met who in the back alley or the back room, and what the deal was that was proposed and how it got negotiated or failed to negotiate. You really lay it out for us, which is so vitally important, especially in this day and age.
Yeah, I also want to point out, I worked very hard on the photographs in the book. There are over 80 photographs altogether, 1 photograph at the head of every chapter, and then 2 inserts of photos. And I got some wonderful photos. There's one of Carter as governor meeting Bob Dylan in the governor's mansion. There's another of Willie Nelson up on stage singing with Carter and Rosie standing right by him. They were very good friends, and Willie Nelson spent not one but several nights in the White House in the Lincoln bedroom, and actually smoked a little reefer on the White House roof with one of Carter's sons. So,
yes, I know which one too.
You know which one too.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask Hal Hardin if he prosecuted anybody for that in those days. It was a very different circumstances for pot in the 1970s than it is in the current generation. With all your expertise in researching and writing biography and all the awards you've won for the history and biography, I have to ask you some what if questions about the Carter administration. What if Charles Curbo, the country acting lawyer who's really a behemoth of the corporate lawyer power fiefdoms in Atlanta in the Southeast. Curbo, who was really the chief inside advisor, I think, to Carter throughout his career. Carter tried to get him to come to Washington with him to be chief of staff, and Curbo said what, did what?
Curbo said no, that he couldn't afford it. And, you know, this was, I think, an exaggeration, but it did turn out that Carter's good friend, Bert Lance, really couldn't afford to come to Washington. And he was a small town banker who lived a large lifestyle, and he literally got into trouble with regulators in Washington and with the US Senate. And there's, you know, he was forced to resign his office as head of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. But Curbo, you know, it's a great what if he had accepted and moved to the White House. He was the one guy who, you know, was disciplined and could say no to Carter. Otherwise, all of Carter's other close advisors, the Georgia boys, were men in their 30s, early 30s. You know.
Right.
Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell, who were very smart and savvy people and good at their job and their work and good values. Nevertheless, that, you know, they were boys. They looked up to Carter almost as a father figure, particularly Jody Powell. And Curbo was someone who could say no to Carter and tell him when he was making a mistake. And he was a very savvy political operator. And one of the breakthroughs I had during the research of the book was to discover that Curbo's papers were not in the Carter Presidential Library. And so during my very first formal interview with President Carter, I pointed this out to him, and he made a point of finding those papers, and they were 5 cardboard boxes in the attic of Curbo's widow. And 6 months later, I was given complete access to all of these papers, and it was a treasure trove for this biographer. It was, you know, it allowed me to see memos that Curbo had written to Carter on advising him how to win the governorship in 1970, what issues to pursue, how to talk about the Vietnam War that was still raging and was still very controversial. And so Curbo had a political sense that would have been valuable to Carter during the White House years that was lacking. And instead, Carter, when Curbo said no, he just decided he was not going to have a chief of staff. He was going to run the inner White House on a sort of spokes of the wheel management system, where he'd be at the center and everyone would report to him. Well, this became very chaotic, and it overburdened the president with too much material, too many decisions to make.
We're going to have to close it down here. I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah Lee to close it. I want to thank you. Thank you for the book. Thank you for tonight. And say to you, when you write the next chapter in the book or the next article on Carter, and stories that I was involved in Georgia the day. Call
okay.
Should be fun. Thank you so much. This was a great discussion. Really appreciate it. Hal, what's wrong with you? No noise. I just see you. No beard, nothing. Unmute. You have to unmute. Also, I want to remind you all about the Thursday event to Southeastern Conference football officials. Our teams may not win, but we need to know how the calls are made. Hal, any closing remarks?
Well, I have really, really enjoyed this, and both of you were just there, and you and the author just were great. I'll tell you a couple of quick stories about Carter. I certainly was not a confidant of his, but over the years, I had a chance to speak with him. We go on these Carter reunions, and also a few times during the campaign. And he was such a blunt speaking man. I mean, he was not a politician. He was not a backslapper at all. I mean, for example, I remember one time, I think it was on a flight to San Diego, going out to one of the conferences, a long flight from Atlanta, and he talking about going to the Pope had died, and you know whether he should go there and so forth. He said, "Would you want to fly 6 or 7 hours with George Bush Jr., Bill Clinton?" You know, he was so blunt about that, or like the time that one of his aides was indicted, and normally, and it was during the time that the U.S. attorneys were having a conference in Washington, which normally the president had always attended, and that night he much to the rage of the attorney general, he was up on the balcony of the White House meeting with the U.S. attorney from Georgia. You know, a lot of people did not understand, but I did. But he was really a fantastic man, I think. And I think that you guys have laid him out there to be the man that he really was, and what a genius he was, and what a true American, still living down there at Plains and overcome so many adversities. And he's really been an inspiration for a lot of us. And I thank you for writing this great book.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for reading.
Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you soon. Safe
Thank you.
travels.
Okay, thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Don't forget the books available at Parnassus Books locally here in Nashville. And I'm sure all of you know a couple of websites on the internet where you can find
Right.
Good night.